Welcome to Lost Ladies of Garden Writing. Today we are talking about Barbara Dodge Borland. And I wrote about her last week, but I wanted to tell you about her today. So Barbara Dodge Borland called herself the Wayward Gardener. And I met Barbara through her husband, the nature writer Hal Borland, who I found while searching for quotes for the gardening podcast, The Garden Angelist, that I record with Dee Nash. We kept finding great quotes by Hal Borland, and some of those quotes led me to read his memoir, which was This Hill, This Valley, in which he described his wife Barbara's tricks for growing lettuce. And I wrote a blog post about those lettuce growing tricks and tips a few years ago, which I actually tried last year. I even searched out the older varieties because he wrote this in 1957, and I managed to find almost all of them. And my lettuce turned out pretty good. Anyway, I didn't think much more about Barbara, his wife, until this summer when I discovered that she didn't just grow great lettuce for Hal to brag about, but she also wrote about it herself. So she's a lost lady of garden writing. Hooray! So let's do her biography, and this is her book. This is the Way My Garden Grows and Comes Into My Kitchen, Barbara Dodge Borland. So her biography on the back simply says, Barbara Dodge Borland, wife of the late Hal Borland, lives in Salisbury, Connecticut. Because of her somewhat unconventional methods of gardening, she had been called the Wayward Gardener and once wrote a column under that name. And so this book came out in 1986. That was 8 years after her husband Hal died. So that is not much information. So I went down into the internet and I went through and I immediately found her obituary, which was very, very nice. And it was in the Berkshire Eagle, Pittsfield, Massachusetts paper. So we now know that Barbara was born in Waterbury, Connecticut, March 15th, 1903, to Harry A. and Grace Cross Dodge. She attended St. Margaret's School in Waterbury and went to Oberlin College in Ohio, which I think is kind of an odd choice for an East Coast girl, but I'm not to say they can't come to the Midwest. Anyway, during the 1930s, she was a freelance editor and writing consultant in New York City, where she also conducted fiction writing workshops. She married Hal Borland in 1945. He was a widower with 3 sons at the time. And then in 1952, they moved to Salisbury, Connecticut, where they lived on a 110-acre farm on Weetog, I think that's how you say it, Weetog Road, beside the Housatonic River. According to her obituary, for over 3 decades, she was a co-author with Hal of novellas, short stories, and periodical articles. And so at the time of her death, which was in 1991, she was survived by one of her stepsons and a daughter, Diana. And so I thought, oh, a daughter, Diana. I went back through the census records, and in 1950, it would appear that her daughter was born around 1935. So I went through Ancestry, newspapers, just to see what was going on, if Barbara had a first husband, what might have happened to him. And I really came up empty. I couldn't find the 1930 census, the 1940 census. I think I did find the 1920 census. So I decided to file all that under none of my business. Anyway, as I said, she was 87 years old when she died. And she asked that there be no funeral or memorial service, donations to go to the Audubon Society. And this book, This is the Way that My Garden Grows, actually came out in 1986. She was 84 years old when this book came out. So if you think you're too old, you're not. Anyway, about her writing. So her husband, Hal, said in a 1960 article in the Berkshire Eagle newspaper, he said that Barbara was one of the best idea gals I've ever known and also one of the best editors. They worked as a team, according to this article, and I'll read this excerpt from it. About 14 years ago, he married Barbara Dodge, a native New Englander, and they have since collaborated on fiction. Barbara Borland was also went to the Columbia School of Journalism, had been an editorial consultant for magazines and publishing houses, and had her own writer's workshop in New York. She and her husband have sold about 40 joint efforts, not including his separately written stories in the magazine marked. Most have been short stories, but they also had 8 magazine novels published in Redbook. Barbara is one of the best idea gals I've ever known of, Borland says, but also one of the best editors. They get a plot, bat it back and forth while driving, gardening, fishing, then they start writing. They write various parts of the story separately, then they put the results together. So, of course, I went looking on the internet to see if some of those magazine novels published in Redbook that they wrote together were out there. I couldn't find them. They could be archived out there, but someone who had to do a lot of searching, and that is probably a winter project. So I also learned that in 1960, Barbara started writing a weekly column for the Berkshire Eagle about gardening, and the editor wrote at the time on March 25th, 1960, quote, judging by her first column yesterday, ardent amateur gardener Barbara Borland writes with much of the same clarity that distinguishes husband Hal Borland's Wednesday contributions to the feature page. High praise, I'd say. So I couldn't figure out when her columns ended, though I did enjoy a few minutes of scrolling through some old newspapers that didn't feature just one column. Like today, if you can find anything about gardening, it's probably one little column on Saturday. These were 2-page spreads every week with multiple articles, several columns, lots of advertisements. Those were the days. Those were the days. So let's talk about her books. In addition to This Is the Way My Garden Grows and Comes Into My Kitchen, Barbara also published a book in 1962 called The Great Hunger, and it's a novel about her Dodge ancestors in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Good use copies available, as they say. Anyway, so This Is the Way My Garden Grows. Let's get into this book a little bit. So on the inside cover, it says, this breezy, forthright book is for anyone who dreams of a thriving vegetable garden, but doesn't want to be a slave to it. With the author's shortcuts and time savers, 3 half hours of care a week is all you need after planting. Weeds can be where you want them, not where they want to be, and most of the bugs that attack plants can be eliminated. The methods here are completely different, often contrary to most gardening instructions, but they work, and they work anywhere in any climate. So, well, that is quite the little blurb, and it is quite the promise. So we'll see if that delivers on the promise. So the book has 4 parts. In part 1, Barbara describes the various gardens that she had, ending with her garden in Salisbury, Connecticut, where she grew that most awesome lettuce. In part 2, she went through a list of vegetables and how she grew them. And of course, lettuce is in that chapter, and several other types of vegetables that she grew. And pardon me for turning pages. Everything from bush beans, lima beans, pole beans, the cabbage family, of course, lettuce, corn, herbs, onion family, peas, New Zealand spinach, which is something I've never grown, many squashes, and some of the plants she buys. And interestingly, she buys, and when she says buys, she's buying the plants. So she starts the others from seed, but she buys plants for tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. Many people do. Part 3 talked about the special gardens, weekend garden, the summer away garden, the child's garden, the 6 weeks away garden, the cold climate garden, and the easiest garden. And the easiest garden does sound intriguing. And then part 4, that's her recipes. The garden comes into the kitchen, and she has information about keeping and preserving, and then various recipes. And some of these recipes, many of these recipes don't actually have quantities. She leaves it to you to figure that out. So let's go to, I wanted to tell you about a couple of things that I found that were kind of interesting. One of them was that, why did I mark this page? Anyway, so she did say that she had rabbit problems, and that if she left some things unprotected, that spinach would be gone, and the early bush beans, wax, and green beans would also be gone. And that is true. She also said of the summer away garden that corn was out, limas with their tender green tips is out. See the rabbit problem. Whole beans need rotenoning. And I thought, rotenoning, what is rotenoning? And then I kind of looked it up, and I figured out that when she said rotenone, what she was meaning was applying a pesticide that they used to use called rotenone, which occurs naturally in some legume type plants, and it's a broad spectrum insecticide. I would not use it today. I would not recommend using it, but people did use it because they wanted to keep bugs off their vegetables. Today, I always feel like I will try my best to do natural methods, and if the insects get them, then that's what happens. So, and you can still buy rotenone. And the interesting thing about rotenone today is I don't see it sold much for vegetable gardeners, but I see it sold as a pesticide. It's a fish killer. And so it's used to remove alien fish species. And I would imagine that if you put it in a pond, it would kill all the fish. So I'm also not recommending that. I'm just pointing out that little interesting thing. So the other thing that caught my eye was the easiest garden, and I will quote, the easiest garden in the world would be Jerusalem artichokes, asparagus, rhubarb, chives, horseradish, and mint. That is, if you don't want to spend any time taking care of the garden. The trouble is that all these spread except horseradish, which you can have more of if you throw out some cuttings from the roots. I cannot imagine what that garden would be like. In fact, I don't want to see that garden. And so that garden really is, it's perennial vegetables. That's what those all have in common. So you could harvest something to eat by planting all perennial vegetables. But as Barbara says, we don't want to see that. So then on to the recipes. One of the recipes she had was for what she called a 10-minute potato salad. And she says, with potatoes in the garden and hard-boiled eggs in the house, I'm ready all summer long for an unexpected guest or two. This potato salad takes me only 10 minutes, but I was somewhat surprised when it took a helpful teenager 2 hours to make it under my direction. And the ingredients are, and there are no quantities, potatoes, hard-boiled eggs, red radishes, parsley, dry mustard, vinegar, salt, pepper, and paprika. So she says to peel potatoes and slice in half-inch slices, cook in boiling salted water for 5 minutes, drain, place in a shallow bowl, add dry mustard and chopped up boiled egg, add some vinegar, hold the parsley because vinegar will change its color, add it at the last minute, add tiny slivered red radishes for tang. Then she says a bit of wild mustard or a bit of snipped dandelion stems or a snipped horseradish leaf if you have them. Famous New York restaurateurs use mustard crest for tang. I understand, so why not me? Anyway, she says, I add no mayonnaise at this point. Perhaps I shall on the next day if I have any left over, but I seldom do. Then she says, I often make enough potato salad to add either cooked bush beans or cooked beets, either of which provide extended use of that potato salad. And with the delightful salad in the kitchen, I am happily out of the garden. And that's just one of her recipes from her book. So the other thing I would say is always look for quotes in these old gardening books. And one of the quotes, if I was sitting across from her at her kitchen table, I think she would say exactly what she said in the book. I am a wayward, willful, contrary gardener. I don't follow seed packet directions. I find my methods of shortcuts and time savers so much easier. And her basic time saver is she would sow the seeds thickly, not thinly. And then when it was raining, she would dig them out and divide them and spread them out like beans and things. Or for lettuce, she would pick the thinnings and eat them. And then the lettuce would continue to grow. The other quote, and I made a meme for this, a picture, a graphic with it. She says, a gardener learns more in the failures than in the successes. And I think that is true. So that's just a sampling of Barbara's breezy, forthright book on gardening, as she says. As I read more of it, I am inclined to try more than just her lettuce growing tips. So I might do some things next year out in the garden. Anyway, she is a welcome addition to the growing list of lost ladies of garden writing. And I'm happy to present her to you. Let me get that out of the sun. There you go. Anyway, I will return shortly with another video, another writer. But if you know of any women authors of gardening books that I should research as lost ladies, always you can leave a comment here. You can find me on the internet all over the place and leave a comment. And I will leave a link below to the Substack article I wrote about her, and also to the blog post I wrote about growing her lettuce. Anyway, that is all I have for today. As they always say, whatever you're doing, if you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you're watching this or listening to this as a podcast episode, I hope you're following me. Bye now.